Claire never expected her father's final will to shock her $1 to her millions to others, yet that single coin held a secret that would change everything, a hidden legacy in Maple Creek, a library, and a community waiting for her. Follow Claire as she uncovers the truth, rebuilds her family, and discovers love and hope in unexpected places. If this story moves, you don't forget to like and subscribe for more heart-touching journeys. The courthouse in downtown Portland smelled faintly of polish and stale coffee, the kind that clung to the air after a long morning of bad news. Claire Donovan sat motionless on the wooden bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if she could still hold on to something, perhaps time itself, perhaps the small hand of her son. The judge's words still hung in her ears, heavy and final. Primary custody will remain with Dr. Richard Donovan. A single sentence that felt like a door closing forever. She didn't cry at first, not because she was strong, but because she didn't quite understand how to move. The world had shifted quietly, as if gravity had tilted against her. When she finally stood, her knees wobbled slightly, and the papers she held trembled like autumn leaves. Richard stood near the exit, his suit impeccable, his expression polite but unreadable. "It's for the best." He murmured, his tone sterile, the way he might speak to a patient he couldn't save. Claire wanted to tell him that love wasn't a clinical condition, that hearts didn't heal under fluorescent light. But she only nodded, her voice too broken to trust. Ethan waited by the car outside, his small backpack slung unevenly over his shoulder. He saw her and raised a hand, hesitant, torn between parents the way a leaf is torn between wind and branch. "I'll call you okay, Mom?" he said, his voice high and shaky. She forced a smile. Every night she promised, though she already knew there would be nights when the call never came. As the car pulled away, her reflection followed it in the glass doors of the courthouse, just a faint figure fading behind tinted windows. Outside, the February air was sharp enough to taste. She walked slowly toward her old Honda parked along the curb, its faded paint the same dull blue as the morning sky. Inside, the silence was unbearable. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and finally let herself cry. It wasn't loud. It was the quiet kind of crying that sounds more like breathing than sobbing, the kind that empties you. Her phone buzzed once, her lawyer perhaps, or a friend offering consolation, but she couldn't bear to hear another voice reminding her of what she'd lost. By the time she reached her small apartment on the east side of town, the sun was already lowering behind the Willamette River, scattering cold light across the water. She opened the fridge to find a half carton of milk, 2 apples, and a forgotten bottle of cheap white wine. She poured a glass and stood by the window staring at the city lights flickering to life. Down below, a mother crossed the street with her little girl, their hands linked, the child's laughter drifting upward like music. Claire turned away. That night she took Ethan's old baseball glove from the closet. It still smelled faintly of leather and dust. She remembered the afternoons in the park, when he used to run toward her, cheeks red from the wind, shouting, "Mom, did you see that catch?" And she would always cheer no matter how small the throw. Now the glove felt like a relic from another life. She pressed it to her chest until the ache softened into exhaustion. Sleep didn't come easily. The apartment creaked with every passing car, and her thoughts wouldn't stay still. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, she dreamed of the courthouse again. But this time the benches were empty, and she was the only one left inside, clutching a verdict that dissolved in her hands. When she awoke, the morning light spilled through the blinds like thin gold threads, mocking in its gentleness. She lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling until her phone vibrated again, this time with a message from an unknown number. It was the law office of Graham Pierce, her father's old attorney. "Please call regarding the estate of Walter Donovan," her father. She hadn't spoken to him in nearly a decade. The distance between them had stretched quietly after her mother's death, until neither knew how to reach the other. She hesitated before calling back, her voice hoarse from the night before. "This is Claire Donovan," she said. "You said it's about my father?" The lawyer's tone was courteous but formal. "Yes, Miss Donovan. I'm sorry for your loss. Your father passed away last week. The reading of his will is scheduled for Friday morning. You're named as a beneficiary. Beneficiary. The word sounded alien, almost hopeful. But hope, she reminded herself, was dangerous. She thanked him, hung up, and sat in silence. The room suddenly felt smaller. She thought of her father's quiet farmhouse outside Eugene, the smell of cedar and pipe smoke, the way he used to hum old country songs while fixing things that were already broken. She hadn't seen him since before the divorce. She told herself she was too busy, too proud, too tired. Now it was too late. When she finally stepped outside, the city had begun to stir, the rumble of buses, the hiss of coffee machines, the murmurs of people beginning their day. She tightened her coat and started walking. Somewhere above, clouds were gathering over Portland's skyline, thick and gray like smoke. She didn't notice the drizzle beginning to fall. She only felt the weight of everything she could no longer change. That night she wrote a note to herself on a torn page of a notebook, "Find strength in the small things." Then she taped it to the fridge door. It wasn't a plan, it was survival. The law office was quiet, except for the faint ticking of a wall clock and the soft hum of a printer somewhere in the next room. The rain had followed Claire from Portland, smearing the windows in wavering lines. She sat across from Graham Pierce, a man in his 60s with kind but steady eyes and a voice that carried the weight of years spent delivering both good and bad news. Your father was a private man. He began sliding a small envelope across the polished oak table. Most of his estate has been arranged through charitable trusts and land deeds. What he left you is unconventional. Claire frowned slightly, glancing down at the envelope. It was plain cream-colored, sealed with an old-fashioned wax stamp pressed into the shape of a gull. Her heart caught. Her father used to carve that exact symbol into the handles of his fishing rods. "He asked that I give this to you personally," Graham said, "and that you open it alone." She hesitated, feeling the weight of the paper in her palm. "Did he say anything else?" "Only that you'd understand when you saw it." Outside, the drizzle had become a steady rain by the time she reached her car. She sat there for a moment, staring at the envelope resting on the passenger seat, the wax glistening faintly in the dim light. Her breath fogged the glass as she broke the seal. Inside was a single dollar bill folded neatly in half. It wasn't new, its edges worn and soft from handling. But across its surface, scrawled in blue ink, were the words, "For the one who still believes in kindness." Her throat tightened as she read it aloud, barely above a whisper. Kindness, she repeated, as though the word itself were something fragile. At first she thought it must be some strange mistake, a sentimental note, perhaps, or a cryptic farewell. But when she turned the bill over, she saw something else. In the lower left corner, faint but deliberate, was a tiny engraving of a seagull, her father's symbol, the same one he used to mark his workshop tools and his handmade bookshelves. She traced the outline with her thumb, and the paper felt warm against her skin, as if it carried something more than ink and memory. Then, as she folded the bill, something thin and stiff shifted inside. A slip of paper, almost invisible, tucked between the folds. Her hands trembled as she eased it out. The note was written in her father's familiar script, steady, precise, every letter deliberate. "If you're reading this, it means I've gone. Go back to Maple Creek, the place you once said you'd build a small library for everyone. Some things are still waiting for you there." The handwriting made her chest ache. She hadn't seen that careful penmanship in years, not since the postcards he used to send her during college, always the same sign-off, "Be kind, even when the world forgets how." She folded the note again and pressed it to her lips. The car was silent except for the rain tapping on the roof, rhythmic, relentless. Maple Creek. She hadn't thought of that name in over a decade. The small town in southern Oregon where she'd spent her childhood, where her mother used to hang laundry under the old maple trees, and where she'd dreamed of opening a library in the abandoned post office building. Her father had stayed behind after her mother's death, clinging to that quiet town long after Claire had left for college, marriage, and the city. When they last spoke, their conversation had ended badly. He'd told her that some dreams were worth returning to, and she'd told him she didn't have time for dreams anymore. Now sitting in her rain-soaked car with that $1 bill in her hand, she felt the sting of regret so sharp it almost drew blood. That night she placed the dollar and note on her kitchen table beside a half-empty mug of tea. The lamplight cast soft shadows across the paper. She studied the gull symbol again, tracing its wings. It looked like it was mid-flight, rising from the edge of the world. "What were you trying to tell me, Dad?" she whispered. The apartment around her seemed smaller than ever, the refrigerator hum louder, the city sounds dull and far away. Later she tried to sleep, but couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the small white church at the edge of Maple Creek, the smell of pine and the crunch of gravel beneath her shoes as she'd walked to the store as a child. She remembered the creek itself, shallow and bright, where she and her father used to skim stones until dusk. Maybe he'd gone back there near the water to find peace in his final days. Maybe he'd built something, left something unfinished. Just past midnight, she turned on her bedside lamp and opened the small box of keepsakes she'd hidden in her closet. Inside were old photographs, her father at the wheel of his truck, her mother laughing beside the garden, a younger Claire reading beneath the maple trees. She picked up one photo and ran her fingers over the edges, noticing something she had never paid attention to before the same gull symbol carved into the wooden fence behind them. He had been leaving breadcrumbs all along. The next morning she called in sick to work. "I just need a few days," she told her manager, who sighed sympathetically. She didn't pack much, just a suitcase, her father's letter, and that peculiar dollar bill she kept folded inside her wallet. As she locked her apartment, a chill wind swept down the street, scattering leaves across the pavement. She glanced up at the overcast sky, where a single gull wheeled above the river, white against the gray. For the first time in years, she felt pulled toward something not by obligation or guilt, but by a quiet thread of longing. She didn't know what she would find in Maple Creek, or why her father had called her back there. But somewhere deep down, she hoped it wasn't just about property or inheritance. Maybe, just maybe, it was about redemption. She started the engine, the tires splashing through puddles as she drove south, following the familiar curve of the highway. The rain began to ease, leaving a silver mist hanging over the valley. The dollar bill in her pocket felt heavier than paper should. As the city faded behind her, the world grew quieter, the road narrowing between endless fields of winter grass. By the time she saw the sign that read, "Welcome to Maple Creek, Population 2, 184, the afternoon light had begun to fade, and the first memory of her childhood home flickered to life like a lantern in fog. The road wound through Oregon's quiet countryside, a gray ribbon curling between low hills and forests veiled in mist. Claire drove with both hands gripping the steering wheel, her old sedan humming a tired rhythm that matched her pulse. The heater groaned, blowing air that smelled faintly of dust and pine. Her suitcase sat on the passenger seat, the corner of her father's note peeking out from between the pages of a map she didn't need. She had memorized the turns years ago, back when Maple Creek was the center of her small world. Now it felt like driving backward through time. The fog thickened as she climbed the first ridge. Through the windshield, the outlines of trees appeared like silent witnesses, rows of maple and cedar, their leaves turning gold and red despite the chill. Every so often, a shape in the distance would remind her of something from her childhood. A broken fence, a barn roof, caved in the glint of an old windmill she and her father once fixed together. She remembered the way he had smiled grease on his hands, saying everything worth keeping needs care even when it breaks. She wondered if he'd thought of that when their relationship fractured. The road dipped suddenly toward the valley, and as she descended, the clouds thinned. The town sign appeared just ahead, "Welcome to Maple Creek, founded 1887. The paint had faded, but someone had recently planted marigolds along its base. She slowed the car, taking in the first familiar sights, the diner with its flickering neon clock, the post office with its crooked flagpole, and across the square, Hazel's place. The cafe's windows glowed amber against the gray afternoon, and for a fleeting moment she could almost smell the cinnamon and butter from her father's favorite dessert. She parked along Main Street and stepped out. The air was damp, but soft, carrying that mixture of wood smoke and rain that always lingered here in autumn. Inside the cafe, everything looked smaller than she remembered. The booths were still lined with red vinyl, and the same chalkboard hung above the counter. A woman with silver hair looked up from behind the register. "Claire Donovan," she said after a moment, her eyes widening. "I'll be. It's been, 20 years, 15. Claire said softly. "Hello, Hazel." The older woman wiped her hands on her apron and came around the counter, embracing her with a warmth that nearly undid her. "I'm sorry about your father," Hazel said. "He came in every Friday for pie. Sat at that corner booth near the window. Said it made him feel close to your mother." Claire looked at the empty booth, a half-finished cup of coffee sitting on the table, as if waiting for him still. She ordered a slice of apple pie out of habit, but barely touched it. When she finally left, Hazel pressed a small paper bag into her hand. "For the road," she said. "Your dad always took one to go." Claire thanked her, unable to speak, and stepped back into the drizzle. The house lay 2 miles outside town, down a narrow road lined with wild blackberry bushes. Her father's mailbox still bore his name, W. Donovan. The paint cracked and flaking. The gravel driveway crunched under her tires as she pulled up beside the old porch. The house looked both smaller and lonelier than she remembered, a single-story cabin of darkened cedar, its windows fogged from within, its roof bowed slightly, under years of weather. A for sale sign leaned crooked against the fence, faded nearly white. She stood at the foot of the steps, staring at the door that had once swung open to her laughter and muddy shoes. Now it was shut tight, the lock rusted. She tried the handle anyway. It didn't budge. Through the window she could see outlines of furniture beneath sheets, a ghostly stillness filling every corner. Her father's rocking chair sat by the cold fireplace, tilted slightly forward, as though someone had just stood up and never returned. She circled the porch, wiping rain from her face, until she found the spare key's old hiding place under the flower pot by the steps. Empty. She sighed and sat down on the top step, letting her gaze drift toward the overgrown yard where the apple tree still stood crooked and leafless. She remembered climbing it as a child, her father pretending to scold her while secretly cheering her bravery. That was before everything became complicated, before the silence, the distance, the unspoken disappointments. Now all that remained was the sound of rain hitting the tin roof. On impulse, she pulled up a corner of the doormat, thinking perhaps the key had been moved. Beneath it, she felt something hard. Not a key, at least not an ordinary one. It was small brass cool against her fingers, attached to a thin chain. When she lifted it into the light, she saw it clearly, a key, etched with the outline of a seagull wings spread wide. The same symbol on the dollar bill. Her pulse quickened. She turned it over and saw faint initials carved into the metal, MC. She frowned. Maple Creek. Or perhaps something else. The key felt old, older than the lock on the front door. She tried it anyway, sliding it into the keyhole. It didn't fit. She tried the back door, the shed, even the mailbox. Nothing. It was meant for something else, something hidden. She slipped it into her pocket and stood in the fading light, unsure whether to feel comforted or haunted. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the faint scent of apples and rain-soaked wood. Somewhere in the distance, a lone bird cried, a gull impossibly far from the coast. She looked toward the tree line, where the sound had come from her breath catching for reasons she couldn't name. For the first time, she sensed that her father's message had been more than nostalgia. It was a trail carefully laid, waiting for her to follow. The sky had darkened to slate by the time she returned to her car. She turned the key in the ignition, but instead of driving away, she sat there watching the cabin through the windshield. Her reflection stared back at her older, wearier, but with something new flickering beneath the fatigue, curiosity, perhaps even resolve. She took the dollar bill from her wallet, unfolded it, and laid it on the dashboard beside the brass key. 2 clues from a man who had always spoken in quiet gestures. Rain began again, tapping softly against the glass, blurring the outlines of the world beyond. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and let the sound fill the silence. Somewhere between the rhythm of the rain and the echo of her father's handwriting, she thought she heard a whisper. Not in words, but in memory, urging her toward the next step she hadn't yet discovered. The next morning broke gray and wet mist draping the valley like a veil. Claire woke in the driver's seat of her car, stiff and cold. She had fallen asleep watching the cabin, the brass key heavy in her pocket. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of damp wood and moss. She stepped out, stretching her shoes, sinking into the muddy ground. Behind the house, the yard sloped gently towards the woods. Her father's old tool shed leaned slightly to one side, its door half open, creaking in the breeze. She approached cautiously, pushing the door wider. Inside, dust floated through a shaft of morning light, settling on a workbench lined with rusted tools. Something about the back wall caught her attention, a panel of wood that didn't quite match the rest. She ran her fingers along the edge and felt a groove, the faint outline of a door. Her pulse quickened. The brass key burned cold in her hand. She knelt, searching the wall, until she found a small, round keyhole near the floor, almost invisible under years of grime. The key fit perfectly. The lock clicked with a sound that echoed faintly beneath the earth. When she pulled the panel open, a breath of cool, musty air drifted out. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. She hesitated only a moment before fetching a flashlight from the car. The beam sliced through the gloom, revealing earthen walls reinforced with timber. The steps groaned as she descended. The space at the bottom was small, no more than a single room carved beneath the shed, but it was tidy in its own way, the air still and heavy with the scent of old paper. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes, binders, and leather-bound notebooks. She set the flashlight on a crate and began to explore. There were receipts for lumber and bricks correspondence with donors, and sketches of a building labeled Maple Creek Public Reading Hall. She traced the pencil lines of the drawing, her heart clenching as she realized what it was, a plan for the community library she had once dreamed of as a child. Her father had kept it refined, it maybe even tried to build it. On one shelf, a faded photograph caught her eye. It showed her father standing beside a group of children, most of them barefoot, holding donated books. The back was dated 1987, the same year her mother had fallen ill. He must have volunteered at the town shelter long before Claire ever understood what it meant to give quietly. She found a leather notebook tied with twine, the edges worn soft. Inside were her father's small, neat letters. "If you're reading this, it means I no longer have the strength. I've left behind what I could not finish. Maple Creek deserves a place where knowledge is free and kindness is the currency. You once dreamed of this, Claire. It was never just my dream, it was ours." She pressed her fingers against the page, her eyes blurring. The light trembled slightly in her hand. As she turned more pages, the handwriting grew shakier. Dates became inconsistent, sentences faltered. It was the writing of a man losing his battle with time. One entry caught her breath. "Paul came again today. He insists I sign the transfer papers so he can manage the property. I told him I wanted Claire to decide what happens to this land. He said she's too busy, that she's forgotten this place. Maybe he's right. But still, I'll find a way to leave her something she'll understand." Claire froze. Paul, her older brother. She hadn't spoken to him in years, not since their father's health began to fail, and arguments over care and money had torn them apart. She flipped through the notebook faster, finding receipts in Paul's name legal forms, marked with her father's shaky signature. A deed transfer. Date, August 2019. That was when her father's Alzheimer's had worsened. The realization struck her like cold water. Paul had taken everything, the house, the land, while their father was too sick to understand what he was signing. A folded letter slipped out from between the pages, written in that same weak hand. "Claire, if you find the dollar, you'll know it was never a punishment. It's the key to truth, the signal I left for the one who still believes in kindness. I knew you would come back. Not for wealth, but for what was right." Her breath trembled as she sank onto a stool, the paper crinkling in her hands. She remembered the last time she and Paul had spoken. He'd accused her of abandoning their father, of running away from responsibility. She had shouted back that he cared more about money than family. Then silence. Now the silence had become an echo of betrayal. Claire reached for another box labeled simply "Estate Pending." Inside were photocopies of bank statements, property evaluations, and a letter from a law firm she recognized, the same firm that had contacted her. One paragraph was underlined in red ink: "Upon death of Walter Donovan, remaining assets are to be released to Paul Donovan as executor, excluding items specified in personal correspondence." That meant the envelope she received the dollar and the note was all her father had been able to protect for her. She ran her hand through her hair, trying to steady her breathing. The weight of anger and sorrow pressed down, but beneath it was something else: clarity. The dollar had been his way of guiding her past the lies, past the legal walls Paul had built. He had left her a trail of kindness, the only kind of justice he still believed in. As she rose to leave, the flashlight beam caught something on the far wall, a calendar pinned crookedly marked with circles and notes. One date stood out: July 12th, meet at site. Next to it, her father had written a single word: Bluebird. She frowned, whispering the word aloud. It wasn't a name she recognized, but beneath it, faint and almost erased, was another line of handwriting. The place where it began. She turned off the light and climbed back up the narrow stairs, the smell of old paper still clinging to her clothes. Outside, the sky had darkened again, clouds gathering over the valley like a warning. She locked the shed door behind her, the key cool in her palm. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the hills deep and low, as though the earth itself remembered everything her father could not say. She looked toward the tree line and whispered Bluebird, tasting the word like a clue. The wind rose suddenly, scattering leaves across the yard. She held the notebook tight against her chest and felt for the first time that she wasn't just uncovering her father's past, she was stepping into it. Claire's car rattled over the uneven roads leading to her brother's home, the key to the shed and the dollar bill resting in her coat pocket like twin weights against her chest. The sky was gray, the mist hanging low over the rolling hills, swallowing the edges of the road. She rehearsed the words she would say over and over. "Paul, you have to do the right thing. Father intended me to finish his work. You cannot erase that." When she arrived, the house loomed large and pristine, the kind of house that seemed built to display wealth rather than shelter a family. Paul's car was in the driveway, a black SUV gleaming under the drizzle. Inside, the house smelled of polished wood and coffee, and Paul greeted her in the foyer with a cool, calculating smile. His sharp eyes seemed to measure every inch of her, every ounce of determination she carried. "Claire," he said, voice smooth but cold. "I was wondering when you'd show up." She held the envelope and the dollar in her hand like a shield. "Paul, I know what you did to Father. I want the property and the assets returned, or at least for the will to be re-examined. It's not too late to do the right thing." Paul laughed low and empty. "Do the right thing?" he echoed. "You've always been weak, Claire. Dad left you $1 because he knew you would never be strong enough to hold on to anything else. That dollar, that's a joke. It was his kindness, thinking you'd follow some foolish fantasy instead of grasping what really matters." His words landed like stones, each one heavy and cold. Claire's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stay upright to hold his gaze. "This isn't about the dollar," she said. "It's about the life he wanted you to see: Maple Creek, the library, the children. I will not let you erase that." Paul's expression darkened. "Then I suppose I'll have to protect my interests," he said. Within days, the legal papers arrived, a suit against Claire alleging trespassing, theft, and defamation. She read the documents with shaking hands, her vision blurred by tears she refused to release. The courthouse where she had once lost custody of Ethan now seemed an endless cycle of powerlessness, but the stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about her or a small inheritance. It was about the legacy of a man she had loved, who had trusted her with the truth. She returned to her small apartment that evening, exhausted and hollow. The rain had picked up again, drumming against the window pane, a metronome marking the rhythm of her despair. She sat at the edge of the couch, the dollar bill still folded neatly in her wallet, the brass key resting on the coffee table. She dialed Ethan's number with trembling fingers. Her heart raced as the line connected. "Ethan," she whispered. "Mom." His voice was small, hesitant, laced with the innocence of a child torn between two worlds. I miss you." Claire's eyes blurred as tears fell freely, tracing lines down her cheeks. "I miss you too, baby," she said, trying to steady her voice. "I'm doing everything I can to— Don't talk about that," his voice cracked. "Dad says you're not stable, that you can't take care of us. He said you shouldn't be here, Mom. He said you might ruin things." The line went silent for a heartbeat, her chest tightening so sharply it was painful. "Ethan, listen to me. I will do everything to prove him wrong. I love you, always. You and your sister are my heart." A sigh, shaky, and then a whisper. I hope it's true, Mom." The connection clicked dead. Claire's hands trembled, the phone slipping from her grasp. She sank to the floor, leaning against the window, watching the rain smear the city lights into streaks of silver and gray. The apartment felt colder than ever, the walls tighter, the shadows heavier. She pressed her forehead to the glass, staring at nothing and everything at once. Paul's betrayal, her father's passing, Ethan's distance, they coalesced into a crushing weight. She wanted to scream, to shake the world into understanding, but no sound came. Her reflection in the window stared back, exhausted, defeated, yet still holding the traces of fire in her eyes. That fire, small, fragile, was all that remained of her hope. The dollar in her wallet felt heavier than ever, a symbol of both promise and pain. It wasn't just money, it was a key, a message, a lifeline left by the man who had always seen more in her than the world did. Her mind replayed his words from the note, the one who still believes in kindness. Claire had believed she had driven hundreds of miles. She had uncovered truths hidden for decades. And yet now she faced the coldest form of resistance, family, turning against family, her own child kept at a distance, and the law stacked against her. She sank lower, resting her arms on the sill, letting the dim light wash over her tear-streaked face. The brass key glinted faintly under the lamp, a reminder that a path existed, though obscured, fraught with obstacles. She pressed it to her lips, whispering, "I won't give up. Not for him, not for Paul, not for anyone. I'll find a way for you, Ethan. I promise." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes, carrying the distant rumble of thunder across the city. Claire pressed her hand against the glass, feeling the vibrations under her fingertips. Somewhere beyond this apartment, beyond Paul's lies and Richard's control, lay the chance to reclaim what had been stolen and honor her father's vision. She just had to reach it. Claire wandered through the misty streets of Maple Creek. Her mind still weighed with the confrontation with Paul and the voicemail from Ethan that had left her shaking. The town was quiet in the early evening, the lamplight casting halos on the wet pavement, reflections stretching like fragile memories. As she walked past the old high school, a familiar voice called her name, Claire Donovan. She turned sharply, and there, leaning against a lamppost, stood Tom Walker. His face had aged with gentle lines, but his eyes still carried the same intensity she remembered from their high school days. "Tom, I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her voice tight, a mixture of disbelief and relief. "I just came back for something important," he replied, concern softening his tone. They walked together toward a nearby cafe, the rain starting again, light and persistent, soaking the shoulders of their jackets. Inside, the warmth of the cafe contrasted sharply with the chill that had settled in Claire's chest. They found a corner booth, the smell of coffee and baked goods wrapping around them like comfort. Claire recounted everything: the dollar bill, the note from her father, the hidden key, the shed and its secret room, the journals and sketches of the library, and finally the betrayal by her brother Paul. Tom listened intently, his brow furrowing, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. "This is serious," he said finally, "more than a family dispute. There's a trail of deception here that needs to be exposed." He pulled out his notebook and laptop, and they began to map out what they knew. Paul had transferred assets under the guise of business dealings, used shell companies, and established accounts in the Cayman Islands, shielded from scrutiny. Claire felt a flicker of hope, a spark that had been missing since Ethan's voicemail. Over the following days, Tom dug through public records, interviewed former colleagues of Paul, and pieced together evidence of document forgery and financial obfuscation. Claire assisted providing the letters, the journals, and photographs from her father's hidden archive. The closer they got, the more audacious Paul's actions seemed, and the more determined Claire became. She realized this was no longer just about her inheritance. It was about her father's life's work, the integrity he had tried to preserve, and the dream of a library from Maple Creek that had been nearly erased. One late afternoon, Tom called her with urgency. "I have it," he said, his voice low but excited. "The Cayman accounts, the falsified deeds, the forged signatures, it's all here." They reviewed the documents together in Claire's small rental, cross-referencing dates and signatures verifying the authenticity against her father's handwritings from the journals. Claire's hands shook as she saw the patterns of deception laid bare, the trail from her father's last days to Paul's calculated schemes. It was proof undeniable, and yet it felt surreal, as though decades of betrayal were condensed into a single moment. With the evidence in hand, Tom wrote his article titling it, "The Dollar Heir." The piece recounted the story of the mysterious $1 bill, the hidden journals, the secret key, and Paul's fraudulent actions, but it was more than just a scandal. It highlighted the themes of integrity, kindness, and the responsibility to honor one's heritage. Claire read the draft, her eyes welling with tears. She recognized the way her father had guided her, not with wealth or instruction, but with subtle signals, trusting that she would see the truth. The article went live on the local news website, shared on social media, and soon picked up by regional newspapers. The town of Maple Creek buzzed with excitement and outrage. People who had known Claire as a child, her father as a man of quiet kindness, spoke openly about the revelations. Small groups gathered outside the cafe and on the sidewalks, discussing the story with a mix of shock and admiration. The local radio station hosted live interviews, and reporters from larger media outlets began calling. Claire felt both exhilarated and terrified. This exposure could backfire, but it also meant that the truth was no longer hidden in shadow. By evening, a crowd had gathered outside her father's old house, neighbors, and townspeople drawn together by curiosity, empathy, and outrage. They wanted to see the place where a man's vision had been nearly stolen and where his daughter had returned to reclaim it. Claire stood at the edge of the crowd, the dollar bill in her pocket, the brass key against her palm. The rain had eased, leaving the streets slick and shiny, reflecting street lamps and headlights like scattered stars. She felt the weight of the community's attention, a strange comfort in the collective witness of what had transpired. Messages poured in, old friends, former teachers, even strangers who had read the story online, offering support and connections. Donations to help research the properties and verify her father's intentions appeared overnight. Claire realized that the narrative had transformed from a personal struggle into a symbol. It wasn't just about her family or her father anymore. It had become a story about honesty, the courage to challenge wrongdoing, and the power of one person's persistence in preserving a legacy. Sitting in her small apartment that night, she read the first comments beneath the online article. Words of encouragement mingled with accounts from others who had been wronged, people inspired to act, to speak, to protect what was good. Claire felt a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt since Ethan's voice trembled on the phone. Her father's faith in her, symbolized by that $1, was resonating far beyond her imagination. Somewhere in the distance, the lights of the town glimmered through the mist, and Claire thought she could almost hear her father's voice, calm, steady, reminding her that the smallest signals sometimes carried the greatest weight. The road ahead was still uncertain, fraught with legal battles and personal confrontations, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a thread of clarity guiding her, a flicker of light breaking through the long night of despair. The storm arrived without warning, a relentless downpour that battered the town with the sound of 1,000 tiny drums. Claire had stayed late at her father's old property, sorting through papers and notebooks she had recovered with Tom's help. The night was alive with the scent of wet earth and burned wood from previous controlled fires in the valley. But she didn't think much of it, engrossed in the letters and financial documents Tom had verified. A sudden flare of orange light reflected through the rain-soaked windows, startling her. Heart-pounding, she ran outside, the wind ripping at her coat, and saw flames licking the roof of her father's house. Smoke twisted into the stormy sky, thick and acrid. Panic surged through her. Memories of childhood flooded back, the warmth of the kitchen, her father's gentle voice, the scent of his tobacco and coffee mingling with vanilla from baked pies. She felt an almost physical grief, fearing that decades of personal history, the last traces of her father's life, would vanish in an instant. She rushed to the door, fumbling with the old lock, but the heat was intense, the flames unrelenting. From the corner of the yard, she noticed a small steel box, blackened on the outside, but surprisingly intact, partially shielded by the collapsed porch roof. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she approached, hands trembling violently. Kneeling in the mud and debris, she opened it carefully, the metal warm but unyielding. Inside, neatly stacked, were her father's final savings, totaling $2.5 million, alongside a letter with handwriting she knew better than any other on the planet. Her hands shook as she unfolded the paper, tears mixing with rain streaking her face. "My dear Claire, do not let money define your worth. What matters is the love you give to others. That is the legacy I leave for you." Her chest ached, the weight of his words more than the weight of the money. She pressed the letter against her lips, whispering his name, unable to speak aloud. The storm raged around her, yet she felt a strange calm, as though her father's voice had found her, guiding her through the chaos. She clutched the dollar in her pocket and the key in her hand, a talisman of hope and endurance. The following weeks blurred into a whirl of legal filings, court dates, and document verification. Tom's investigative work proved invaluable. Every falsified deed, offshore account, and misappropriated asset was meticulously documented. Claire sat in the courthouse, a quiet resolve settling over her like armor. The judge, a stern woman with discerning eyes, reviewed the evidence and the testimony, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Paul, sitting across the courtroom, maintained a cold composure, but the slightest twitch in his fingers betrayed unease. The verdict was swift, yet heavy with consequence. Paul Donovan was found guilty of asset fraud and forgery. He was sentenced to 3 years of probation, required to return all property and holdings to Claire, and prohibited from transferring any assets without court approval. The gavel slammed, reverberating through the chamber. Relief washed over Claire in waves, mingling with exhaustion. Her knees weakened slightly, but she steadied herself against the wooden bench, tears of both triumph and remembrance brimming in her eyes. As she left the courthouse, the sky cleared, the first hints of sunlight slicing through storm clouds. The town of Maple Creek seemed reborn in the quiet morning glow. Friends, neighbors, and community members who had followed the story through Tom's reporting greeted her with smiles and embraces. Their support was tangible, a buffer against the years of isolation and betrayal she had endured. Each nod and handshake reminded her that her father's vision had always extended beyond family and property. It had been about people connection and integrity. Back at her father's house, now officially hers again, she walked through the charred remains with care. The smell of burnt wood lingered, but amid the debris, the steel box and its contents were untouched, a literal and figurative safeguard of her father's final message. She counted the bills in the savings account, verified the records Tom had collected, and finally allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The storm had destroyed the physical walls, but it could not erase the essence of what her father had left behind. That evening, Claire sat by the fireplace with the letter in one hand and the dollar in the other, recounting aloud to Tom and a few close friends the story of her father's foresight of the hidden notes and the subtle guidance that had led her through betrayal and despair. Her voice trembled at first, then strengthened as she relived each moment of discovery, each risk, each fear confronted and overcome. The narrative that had begun with a simple coin had evolved into a testament of courage, honesty, and perseverance. Outside, the final storm clouds drifted east, revealing the stars in the crisp Oregon sky. Claire placed the dollar in a small wooden frame she had crafted herself, a shrine to the journey she had endured and the man who had entrusted her with the truth. She felt a mixture of sorrow for what had been lost, pride for what had been reclaimed, and hope for the future. The weight of responsibility was real, but no longer frightening. It was a mantle she was ready to wear, inspired by her father's unwavering belief in her character. Claire stood in the muddy yard of her father's old property, surveying the skeletal remains of the house and the charred trees around it. The storm had passed, leaving a fresh, earthy scent in the air, and the soft sunlight piercing through lingering clouds. Despite the devastation, Claire felt a surge of determination, a calm certainty that her father's vision would not be lost. She rolled up her sleeves, and with the dollar in her pocket and the steel key safely tucked in her coat, she began coordinating with the local community. Volunteers arrived from neighboring towns, some carrying tools, others bringing food and blankets, all drawn by the story of Walter Donovan's legacy and the courage of his daughter. Each person's presence, each smile and nod strengthened Claire's resolve, transforming despair into purposeful action. The rebuilding process was painstaking. Claire worked alongside carpenters and town volunteers, painting walls, repairing floors, replacing windows broken in the fire. She carefully salvaged materials from the ruins, reusing the old wood for shelves and tables in the library. In the center of the main room, she mounted the singed dollar bill into a simple wooden frame. Its edges blackened, but the inscription still legible, a symbol of resilience and the continuity of hope. The library was to be called Walter's Library, honoring her father's quiet devotion to the community and his lifelong dream of giving children and elders a place to read freely. Every day, Claire interacted with children who wandered by, curious about the construction. She listened to their stories, their laughter echoing through the hallways, still under repair. Each time she read aloud from her father's journals or recounted his visions for Maple Creek, she saw sparks of inspiration in their eyes. Ethan and his classmates joined occasionally, fascinated by the way the building was being restored, by the tiny details Claire emphasized: wood grains, window panes, corners of shelves, and by the story behind the dollar bill. For Ethan, the project became a tangible connection to his grandfather, to his mother's persistence, and to the values that Claire had carried through the storm of betrayal and loss. On the day of the grand opening, the town gathered their umbrellas, a colorful array against the gray morning sky. Claire, in a modest navy dress, felt the familiar flutter of nerves in her chest as she prepared to speak. The library's front doors had been polished a fresh coat of paint, highlighting the carved letters above Walter's Library. A place for every mind. Children in attendance tugged at their parents' hands, eager to explore, while elderly residents marveled at the restored structure, some wiping tears from their eyes. Claire's voice, when she began, was steady but soft, resonant with the emotions of the past months. She spoke of her father's dedication, of the small signals left in a $1 bill, of the hidden journals, and of the community that had rallied to make the dream real. From the back of the crowd, she saw Ethan standing beside Richard, his young face a mixture of awe and anticipation. When Claire paused to let her words sink in, he quietly stepped forward, the wet grass cool beneath his sneakers. Without hesitation, he reached for her hand, his small fingers intertwining with hers. "Mom," he whispered, his voice steady and warm. "I want to be here with you." Claire's eyes welled immediately, tears spilling over as she knelt slightly to meet him at eye level. She pressed her forehead gently to his and whispered, "I want that too, baby. I promise you're home now." Richard, standing slightly behind Ethan, remained silent for a moment, observing the exchange. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic reconciliation, just a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first acknowledgement Claire had seen in years of the light and strength within her, the recognition that she had fought not for wealth or recognition, but for the love and stability of her child. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of completeness, a quiet joy rooted not in victory over her brother or legal documents, but in the return of her family's bond. The ceremony continued with local officials cutting a ribbon and children exploring the newly built shelves and reading nooks. The dollar bill, framed and hung prominently on the main wall, drew many to pause, asking Claire about its significance. She explained simply it was more than money. It was a guide, a message, and a symbol of the trust her father had placed in her. Each visitor left with a sense of awe, some moved to tears, others inspired to think of the legacies they themselves could nurture in their own communities. As evening approached, the sunlight softened, spilling gold across the library's newly restored floor. Claire wandered among the aisles, touching the shelves and noticing the smiles of children engrossed in books. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor with a stack of picture books, occasionally glancing up at her with a bright grin. Richard quietly observed occasionally, nodding, letting his son's joy speak louder than any words could. Claire realized that the library had become more than a building. It was a sanctuary, a tangible manifestation of her father's love, her perseverance, and the power of small, deliberate acts of kindness. The town of Maple Creek, once sleepy and indifferent, now buzzed with renewed purpose and connection. Claire walked to the front of the library, gazing up at the framed dollar bill, now a beacon of resilience and hope. Her father's vision had survived fire, betrayal, and storms. It had become living proof that the most meaningful legacy is not wealth, but love, dedication, and community. Claire felt her heart lift, a quiet certainty settling in her chest. This was just the beginning, and every child who crossed the threshold would carry forward the lessons of perseverance, integrity, and hope that her father had entrusted to her. The first snow of the season fell quietly over Maple Creek, settling in delicate layers across the rooftops and the freshly painted walls of Walter's library. Claire watched the flakes drift past the window from her office, a steaming cup of herbal tea in her hands, the warmth seeping into her chilled fingers. The library had grown far beyond what she had imagined. New shelves lined the walls, reading corners offered cozy spaces for children and elders alike, and local volunteers had established weekly storytelling sessions, science workshops, and small gardening projects. Yet despite the tangible successes, Claire felt a quiet loneliness, the kind that lingered in the spaces between moments of triumph. She had rebuilt a legacy, but her heart still bore the marks of past betrayals and losses. Tom Walker had been a constant presence through it all. He had spent countless hours helping her organize the library's records, coordinating volunteers, and even fundraising for supplies. His quiet patience and steady humor had become a source of comfort, but Claire had resisted the pull of their growing closeness. Memories of loss and broken trust made her hesitant. To open her heart again was both terrifying and exhilarating. On a particularly cold evening, she found herself lingering over paperwork at her desk, the snow outside thickening and muffling the usual hum of the town. A knock at the door brought her out of her reverie. Tom stepped inside, his coat dusted with snow, holding 2 mugs steaming with cocoa. "Thought you could use a break," he said softly, handing her one of the cups. They sat together near the library's large window, the glow from the reading lamps casting warm circles of light on their faces. Claire sipped slowly, savoring the richness, and then looked at Tom, feeling the weight of words unspoken. "I don't know if I can let myself," she began, but he gently interrupted, his eyes steady. "Claire, you've given this town hope when it felt impossible. You've rebuilt dreams from ashes. You've always sought magic in the world, but maybe the magic isn't out there. It's in you." Claire's chest tightened. The words, simple and sincere, cut through layers of fear she hadn't realized she carried. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden, and she let them fall, not from sadness, but from the profound relief of being seen, truly seen, without judgment or expectation. She reached for his hand, tentative at first, then holding firmly, finding in that touch the courage to believe in connection again. Tom's smile was small, gentle, a mirror of her own tentative hope. The library became a hub, not only for Maple Creek, but for the surrounding counties. Claire began organizing programs that extended beyond the building's walls: mobile book drives for remote neighborhoods, science kits for children who had never had access to hands-on learning, and workshops on sustainability inspired by her father's journals. Local media began to take notice, and soon a regional network came to film segments about the library's impact. Claire shared her story with honesty and humility, emphasizing the $1 bill, the hidden keys, the journals, and the perseverance required to restore the library and reclaim her family's legacy. Soon, a national television channel contacted her for a feature segment titled "The Dollar and the Dream." Crew members filmed her interacting with children, overseeing volunteers, and reading letters from her father aloud. Claire recounted the night she found the dollar bill and the message hidden in it, the journey through betrayal, the fire that almost claimed her father's house, and the rebuilding of Walter's library. Her story resonated far beyond Maple Creek. Emails and letters poured in from families across the country inspired by her tenacity and vision. Donations arrived from strangers moved by the narrative, funding the expansion of literacy programs and providing scholarships for children in rural communities. Ethan, now more comfortable with his mother's stability, and the rhythm of life in the library, often helped with deliveries and assisted in cataloging books. He would sit beside Claire during filming, quietly observing and occasionally asking questions about the history of the town, the meaning of each donated item, or the story behind the dollar bill framed on the wall. Watching him, Claire realized that her efforts had done more than preserve a legacy. They had created a place for connection, learning, and love to flourish anew. One evening, as the snow blanketed the town in quiet white, Tom and Claire walked outside, their breath visible in the cold air. He paused, turning to her, and gently touched her arm. "You've given so much to this town," he said, his voice low and steady. "But don't forget you matter too. You've always been searching for miracles, Claire, but sometimes the miracle is who you are." Claire's eyes brimmed with tears this time, from recognition and relief. She realized that her heart could be open again, that her trust could be rebuilt, not just with her community, but with someone who had proven unwavering. The media coverage continued to expand, reaching audiences who had never heard of Maple Creek. Claire's story became emblematic of resilience and hope, inspiring similar initiatives in other rural towns. Libraries began to receive funds, schools organized reading programs, and local newspapers highlighted the importance of preserving personal and communal legacies. Claire, standing in the library surrounded by children laughing and learning, felt the weight of her father's faith, the significance of her own perseverance, and the quiet joy of seeing love and dedication ripple outward. Through these moments, she began to accept that life could offer second chances, that trust could be rebuilt, and that love could emerge slowly, tenderly, and unexpectedly. The dollar bill, the hidden key, the journals, the fire, and the restoration all had been steps toward this realization, a testament to resilience, hope, and the power of human connection. As snowflakes danced in the light spilling from the library window, Claire held Tom's hand, letting herself feel the warmth and possibility of the future. She had fought so hard to reclaim her heart, opening to the love she had once feared to embrace. 3 years had passed since the stormy nights, the fires, and the harrowing court battles that had defined the first chapters of Claire's journey. Each day had been a testament to persistence, love, and the gradual rebuilding of a life once fractured by betrayal and loss. The library had grown into a cornerstone of Maple Creek, its programs flourishing, its walls filled with laughter, learning, and quiet moments of reflection. Claire had poured herself into the community, organizing reading circles, art workshops, and weekend science fairs for children who would otherwise have had no access to such experiences. Her dedication had not gone unnoticed. Parents, teachers, and local officials often spoke of the transformative effect the library had on the town, and the ripple effect reached further with donations from across the country. Her legal battle for Ethan had been painstaking. Paul had resisted every motion, claiming that Claire's commitments to the library and community were distractions from her ability to parent full-time. The court had demanded detailed financial reports, evidence of stability character references, and proof of consistent caregiving. Claire, with meticulous care, had presented budgets from the community trust logs of daily routines with Ethan, testimonials from volunteers, and letters from families benefiting from the library. She had stood in the courtroom, not with anger, but with quiet certainty, knowing that every action she had taken reflected the values her father had instilled in her and the lessons learned from the dollar bill that had started it all. When the judge finally delivered the ruling, the relief that swept over Claire was almost physical. She had been granted full custody of Ethan. The judge emphasized her unwavering dedication, her stable income derived from the library trust, and the nurturing environment she had cultivated not only for her son, but for the community at large. Tears pricked Claire's eyes as she held Ethan close in the courtroom lobby, feeling the weight of the past 3 years lift slightly. He hugged her tightly, his young arms wrapping around her with trust and love, and whispered, "I'm so glad it's us now, Mom." She pressed her cheek to his hair, inhaling the familiar scent of his shampoo and the faint whiff of cocoa from breakfast, a small, perfect comfort in the whirlwind of their lives. That afternoon, they returned to the library, now vibrant and bustling with children and families engaged in activities. Claire and Ethan stood before the main wooden sign outside, its paint chipped from years of weather and the fire that had once consumed part of the property. Together, they set to work repainting it. "Home is not a place, it's a choice," Claire said softly, repeating the phrase she had first seen in a book her father had loved. Ethan dipped his brush into the golden paint, his small hands steady as he followed her guidance. They laughed when paint splashed accidentally onto their sleeves. The joy of the moment unburdened by the past, a celebration of regained normalcy and choice. Inside the library, the framed dollar bill remained in its place, slightly faded at the edges, its message still clear, for the one who still believes in kindness. Claire often found herself standing before it, letting her gaze linger on the words, thinking of the long path that had led her here. She had discovered hidden keys, battled deceit, reclaimed property, survived fire and betrayal, and built a sanctuary of learning, hope, and love. The dollar was no longer a symbol of scarcity or insult, but of faith, vision, and the subtle ways in which guidance can be encoded in the smallest gestures. Throughout the day, families visited, sharing their gratitude and excitement about the programs Claire had established. Ethan ran ahead to help a group of children organize books into the shelves, his face lighting up as he guided them with confidence. Claire watched him, feeling a profound mix of pride, love, and quiet amazement at how far they had come. She thought of her father, his journals, the hidden messages, and the faith he had placed in her. Every hardship, every setback, every moment of despair had led to this tangible triumph of a home, a community, and a family, united not by wealth or inheritance, but by love and perseverance. The evening sun cast long golden beams through the library windows, illuminating dust particles in the air like floating stars. Claire found herself alone for a moment, Ethan off helping with a volunteer project in the reading corner. She walked to the front, her hand brushing the wooden frame of the dollar, feeling the slight unevenness of its burned edges. The message resonated deeply within her. It had been a call to believe, to act, and to nurture, and it had guided her through every challenge. She whispered softly to the empty room, "I understand now, Dad. I understand what you meant." A gentle knock at the door announced Ethan's return. He bounded over, holding a small stack of freshly organized books. "Mom, look! We did it!" he exclaimed, his eyes wide with excitement. Claire knelt to meet him at eye level, ruffling his hair affectionately. "Yes, baby," she said, her voice steady, yet soft. "We did it together." They stood for a moment, hands clasped, the weight of the past and the promise of the future balanced perfectly in that space between them. The library, the town, and their lives felt whole. The dollar bill, the restored building, the paint on the sign, and the laughter echoing through the reading rooms were proof that legacies are not measured in wealth, but in love, action, and resilience. Claire smiled a true, unguarded smile that reached her eyes, reflecting the clarity and peace she had fought so hard to reclaim. Ethan mirrored her expression, their bond solidified through trials and triumphs, an unbreakable tether of family and hope. In that moment, as sunlight streamed across the floorboards and dust motes danced in the warm glow, Claire understood that the real inheritance had never been money or property. It had been faith in herself, in kindness, and in the enduring power of love to heal, protect, and inspire. She had lived it, and now she would teach it every day to her son, to the children of Maple Creek, and to everyone who walked through the doors of Walter's library. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more inspiring tales. I'd love to hear from you. What was your favorite part? And where are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments below.